The conference room went completely silent when my manager slid the project folder away from me across the polished table and said flatly, "You're off the Cornerstone project, effective immediately." His jaw was tight, his eyes avoiding mine completely. Across the table, my coworker Brad smirked, barely trying to hide his satisfaction. My hands clenched into fists under the table as heat rushed to my face, my pulse pounding in my ears. I'd spent 6 months building this project from absolutely nothing. 6 months of late nights, weekends, and missed family events. 6 months of solving problems nobody else could figure out. And now, 1 week before the final deadline, they were removing me like I was some incompetent intern who'd failed to deliver. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but no words came out. The fluorescent lights suddenly felt too bright, the room too small. Brad leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking pleased with himself. My manager, Kenneth, shuffled papers nervously, still refusing to make eye contact with me. This wasn't just a personnel decision. This was deliberate. This was calculated. This was meant to humiliate me. Everyone in that conference room stared at me, waiting for my reaction. The project team, the department heads, even the assistant who brought him coffee, all eyes were on me. I forced myself to smile, though my heart pounded like a drum in my ears and my hands trembled beneath the table. They'd waited until the final week to do this. The final week of a 6-month project. The timing wasn't accidental. It was strategic, designed for maximum impact and minimum ability for me to defend myself. Kenneth cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Brad will be taking over as lead," he announced, gesturing toward Brad, who sat up straighter, practically glowing with unearned pride. "He's been instrumental in the development process, and we feel he's the right person to bring this across the finish line." Instrumental? Brad had barely attended half the meetings. He'd contributed almost nothing beyond occasional comments and suggestions that I'd already thought of weeks earlier. But here he was, being handed my project like a gift wrapped in a bow. The injustice of it burned in my throat. I wanted to scream, to throw the folder back across the table, to list every single contribution I'd made while Brad did essentially nothing. But I didn't. I sat there, smile frozen on my face, while everything I'd worked for was casually taken away. That was the exact moment when my career almost collapsed completely, and simultaneously, the moment when everything fundamentally changed. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that conference room, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my professional life. But this betrayal would become the turning point. Not the ending I feared, but the beginning of something better. Kenneth was still talking, explaining transition procedures and timeline expectations, but I wasn't really listening anymore. My mind was already racing ahead, calculating, planning, considering options. Brad was nodding along enthusiastically to everything Kenneth said, like a student eager to impress a teacher. He had absolutely no idea what he was actually taking on. None of them did. Because while I'd been working on this project, I'd learned to protect myself. I'd learned to document everything. I'd learned that in corporate environments, the person with the best records usually wins, not the loudest voice or the boss's favorite. And I had records. Months and months of detailed, meticulous records. Every email, every revision, every problem solved, every late, every innovation. All documented, all saved, all backed up in multiple locations. They thought they were taking my project. They had no idea what was about to happen. My name is Dana Walker, and I'm 31 years old. I've worked as a senior systems analyst at Blackwell Technologies for 4 years, specializing in complex data integration projects that most people find impossibly difficult. I'm good at my job. Actually, I'm excellent at it, though saying so always felt uncomfortable before this incident. I'd always been the quiet one, the reliable one, the person who got things done without drama or fanfare. That reliability had apparently made me expendable in Kenneth's eyes. The Cornerstone project was supposed to be my breakthrough. It was a massive data migration and integration system for our biggest client, Apex Manufacturing. They were consolidating 15 years of scattered data from 7 different legacy systems into one unified platform. The project was worth $1.2 million to our company, and successful completion would likely lead to additional contracts worth millions more. I'd been assigned as project lead 6 months ago, specifically because nobody else wanted to touch something this complicated. The previous lead had quit after 2 months, calling it impossible, but I saw the challenge differently. I saw patterns, solutions, elegant ways to solve problems that seemed insurmountable. I'd built this project from absolutely nothing, from scattered requirements and frustrated stakeholders, into something that actually worked. 6 months earlier, when I'd first been assigned the Cornerstone project, I'd stayed late almost every single night. My desk lamp would be the only light on in the entire office floor, casting long shadows across empty cubicles. I missed my niece's birthday party because I was debugging integration scripts. I skipped my best friend's wedding shower because I had a critical meeting with the client. I rewrote entire sections of the implementation plan that the previous lead had left in absolute chaos. My partner, Alex, started leaving dinner in the fridge with notes like, "Please eat something," and "I miss you." My mother called less frequently because she knew I'd just apologize for being too busy to talk. Every sacrifice felt worth it because I genuinely believed this project would prove my value to the company. I worked weekends, reviewing data mapping specifications and testing connection protocols. I taught myself 2 new programming languages just to solve specific integration challenges. I created detailed documentation for every single process, knowing that complex projects like this required meticulous records. The client loved me. Apex Manufacturing's CTO, a normally stern woman named Patricia Chen, actually smiled during our progress meetings. "You're the first person who actually understands what we need," she told me once. That validation kept me going through the exhaustion. Then Brad appeared in the picture, seemingly out of nowhere. Kenneth suddenly assigned him to help with the project about 3 months in, right around the time it became obvious that the project would actually succeed. Brad was Kenneth's favorite. Everyone in the department knew it. They played golf together on weekends, their families had dinner together. Brad always got the best assignments, the most visible projects, the opportunities that should have been distributed fairly among the team. He started attending my project meetings, contributing almost nothing of value. He'd make obvious suggestions that I'd already implemented weeks earlier, and Kenneth would praise his insights. He'd ask basic questions about aspects of the project that were clearly explained in the documentation, showing he hadn't bothered to read anything. During one particularly frustrating meeting, Brad suggested we try using an API integration for a problem I'd already solved using exactly that method 2 months prior. "That's actually what we're already doing," I'd said politely, pulling up the technical documentation to show him. Kenneth had frowned at me like I was being difficult. "Let's make sure we're being collaborative here, Dana," he'd said, his tone suggesting I was the problem. Brad just smiled, acting like he'd contributed something valuable. The favoritism was blatant and infuriating. The switch happened exactly 1 week before the final deadline, in that terrible conference room meeting. Kenneth had called it a strategic personnel reallocation during a brief email that morning, giving me no warning about what was actually coming. I'd walked into that meeting thinking we were doing a final progress review before the big deadline. Instead, I'd been ambushed, humiliated in front of the entire team, and removed from the project I'd built from nothing. Kenneth's justification was absurdly thin. "We need fresh eyes on this," he'd said, which made no sense given that Brad had supposedly been helping for months. "Brad has some innovative approaches for the final phase," he'd added, without specifying what those approaches actually were. The real reason was obvious to everyone in that room. Brad wanted the credit, Kenneth wanted to give it to him, and I was simply in the way. Politics trumped competence. Favoritism trumped merit. It didn't matter that I'd done all the actual work. What mattered was who played golf with the manager on Sundays. I gathered my materials slowly, deliberately, while everyone watched. My project binder, my laptop, my notes. Brad reached for the main project folder, and I let him take it. "Good luck," I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady. He nodded, already dismissive, already thinking about how he'd take credit for my work. I didn't yell or scream or make a scene. I didn't slam doors or send angry emails or march straight to human resources. Instead, I nodded politely, thanked Kenneth for the opportunity to have worked on the project, and walked calmly back to my desk. People watching probably thought I was taking it remarkably well, that I was being professional and mature about an unfair situation. They had no idea what was actually happening inside my mind. Inside, I was already planning my next moves carefully and strategically. I'd worked in corporate environments long enough to know that emotional outbursts got you labeled as difficult or not a team player. But calm, documented evidence? That was power. That could change everything. I sat at my desk and opened my personal project files, not the shared drive that Brad now had access to, but my own carefully organized backup system. Everything was there, exactly as I'd meticulously saved it over the past 6 months. I'd learned early in my career to protect my work, to keep detailed records, to never rely solely on shared systems. It was a habit that had served me well before, but never as critically as it would now. I began reviewing files, checking dates, verifying that every piece of documentation was properly organized and time-stamped. I was absolutely calm now, almost unnaturally so. The initial shock and humiliation had transformed into something much more useful: cold, calculated purpose. That night, around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Brad's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before answering, already knowing what this call would be about. "Dana," Brad said, his voice tight, with barely controlled panic. "I can't find the client's key data mapping files. Where did you store them?" I leaned back in my chair at home, sipping tea, completely calm. "Everything I created is in the shared drive, exactly like always," I said pleasantly. "I've always followed company protocol about shared resources." "I've looked through everything," Brad said, frustration creeping into his voice. "All I'm finding are draft versions and incomplete templates. Where are the final implementations?" "The shared drive contains everything I was required to put there," I repeated, my tone friendly and helpful. "All drafts, all collaborative documents, all team resources. That's where they've always been." There was a long pause on Brad's end. "What about the final integration scripts? The completed data mappings? The client validation protocols?" "Those are in my private workspace," I said simply. "As per company policy, individual developers maintain working files in their private systems until projects are formally completed and transferred." Brad's breathing got heavier. "I need those files, Dana." "I understand," I said calmly. "Unfortunately, since I'm no longer on the project, I don't have authorization to transfer incomplete working files. You'd need to go through Kenneth and probably HR to arrange proper documentation for file transfer." I smiled softly to myself after hanging up the phone, a genuine smile this time. Brad had assumed that being handed the project meant he'd automatically have access to everything. He'd thought the shared drive contained finished, ready-to-implement work. He was wrong on both counts. The shared drive did contain extensive materials. I'd put plenty there over the months, but it contained drafts, templates, preliminary designs, meeting notes, and reference documents. All the polished, finalized, actually functional systems lived in my private workspace, exactly as company policy both allowed and encouraged. Our IT security protocols were very clear about this. Individual developers maintained working files in secure, private directories until projects reached formal completion. This prevented unauthorized access, protected intellectual property, and ensured proper version control. I'd followed these protocols perfectly throughout the entire project. Everything in my private workspace was completely legitimate, properly secured, and entirely inaccessible to Brad without formal authorization. And getting that authorization would require Kenneth to officially request file transfer through IT and HR, which would require him to document exactly why the project lead who built everything was suddenly removed at the last minute. That documentation would raise uncomfortable questions. I poured myself another cup of tea and opened my laptop, reviewing my meticulously organized records one more time. Every email thread, every status report, every technical solution, all saved, all dated, all attributed. 6 months of proof that I'd built this project essentially alone. The reality of Brad's situation became clearer over the next day. He frantically searched through the shared drive, finding only pieces of the puzzle without understanding how they fit together. He had templates without the customization logic, He had data schemas without the transformation rules. He had API documentation without the actual integration code. It was like having a recipe that listed ingredients but provided no cooking instructions, no measurements, no temperatures, no timing. You knew what was supposed to go into the dish, but not how to actually make it. Brad called me twice more that first night. I didn't answer, letting it go to voicemail. The messages got progressively more desperate. By morning, he'd sent 3 emails, each one more urgent than the last. I responded professionally to the emails, reiterating that all shared resources were in the shared drive, and that transfer of private working files would need to go through proper channels with appropriate authorization. Kenneth sent me a meeting request for late morning. I accepted without comment. When I arrived at his office, Brad was already there, looking like he hadn't slept. His usually carefully styled hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled. "Dana," Kenneth said, attempting his usual authoritative tone but sounding uncertain. "Brad is having some difficulty locating certain project files. We need you to provide him with everything immediately." 2 days passed, and the project showed absolutely no progress. The deadline loomed just 5 days away now, and Brad was essentially paralyzed. I watched from my desk as he frantically moved between his computer and hurried meetings with Kenneth. The panic was spreading. During those 2 days, I maintained my calm professionalism perfectly. I completed other assignments, attended unrelated meetings, and remained polite and helpful to everyone who asked me questions. When people asked about the Cornerstone project, I simply said, "Oh, Brad's leading that now. You should talk to him." Kenneth held 3 emergency meetings trying to figure out how to move forward. I wasn't invited to any of them, which was fine. I didn't need to be in those rooms to know what was happening. The tension in the office was palpable. People spoke in hushed tones near the break room. The project team members who'd watched me get removed now looked confused and worried. Patricia from Apex Manufacturing called Kenneth directly, asking about the sudden leadership change and requesting a progress update. That call apparently didn't go well, based on Kenneth's expression when he emerged from his office afterward. Brad tried a different approach, attempting to reverse engineer my work from the drafts available to him. But complex system integration doesn't work that way. You can't just guess at the logic and hope it functions correctly. Cracks began forming in Brad's confident facade. The client, Apex Manufacturing, scheduled a progress review meeting for day 3 after my removal. It was a routine check-in they'd requested weeks ago, expecting to review the nearly completed project before the final deadline. I wasn't invited to this meeting either, which was unusual since I'd attended every single client meeting for 6 months. But Brad was the lead now, so Brad had to present the progress. I heard about what happened from 3 different people who were in that room. Patricia asked specific questions about the data validation protocols, the integration testing results, and the rollback procedures in case of implementation failure. These were technical questions that required detailed knowledge of the actual systems, not just the theoretical design. Brad stammered through vague responses. He referenced the documentation he'd found in the shared drive, but couldn't explain how the actual implementation worked. Sweat literally beaded on his forehead as Patricia's questions got more pointed and specific. "Where are we with the legacy system migration from the Detroit facility?" Patricia asked. Brad shuffled through papers. "Still in progress," he said uncertainly. "And the data reconciliation protocols for the financial records?" Patricia continued. Brad's face went pale. "We're finalizing those." Patricia apparently sat back in her chair and said coldly, "You have no idea what the actual status of this project is, do you?" The blame game started immediately after that disastrous client meeting. Kenneth called an internal emergency meeting, and this time I was included. The conference room was tense, the same room where I'd been removed just days earlier. Kenneth was visibly sweating, his usual composure completely gone. "Dana," he began, his tone accusatory, "the client is extremely concerned about the lack of progress. They're saying the person leading this project doesn't understand the systems. Why weren't proper transition documents prepared?" I looked at him calmly, my face neutral. "I wasn't informed that transition documents would be necessary," I said evenly. "I was removed from the project immediately, without any transition period or knowledge transfer process. You should have anticipated that Brad would need comprehensive documentation, Kenneth insisted, trying to make this my fault. All documentation is in the shared drive, exactly where it's always been, I replied, following standard company protocols. Brad jumped in desperately. The shared drive only has drafts. Where are the finished files? In my private workspace, as per IT security policy, I said, my voice still perfectly calm. Individual working files remain in secure private directories until formal project completion and authorized transfer. Kenneth's jaw clenched. This is semantics, Dana. You know what we need. I understand what you need, I agreed. However, unauthorized transfer of secure files violates company policy. I'm happy to cooperate through proper channels with appropriate documentation and authorization from IT and HR. That's when I calmly pulled out my phone and began forwarding emails. Months and months of emails, all meticulously saved and organized. Emails showing my questions to Kenneth that went unanswered for weeks. Emails showing my requests for additional resources that were denied. Emails showing my detailed status reports that clearly demonstrated I was doing all the substantial work alone. Emails showing Brad's minimal contributions and frequent absences from critical meetings. I forwarded them to Kenneth, to HR, to the department head, all while sitting calmly in that conference room. My finger moved steadily across my phone screen, tap, 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 sending evidence after evidence after evidence. These emails document the project timeline, I said professionally. They show who contributed what work, when questions were asked, when resources were requested, and when decisions were made. They provide complete transparency into the development process. Kenneth's face went from red to pale as he checked his own phone, watching the emails arrive one after another. 20 emails. 30, 40, 50. A complete documentary record of 6 months of work. Brad tried to speak. I was helping. These emails show attendance records for all project meetings, I interrupted calmly, pulling up another folder. They show participation in technical discussions, contribution of solutions to problems, and completion of assigned tasks. They're all time-stamped and include meeting notes. The room went absolutely silent. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud in the sudden stillness. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Kenneth stared at his phone, scrolling through the mountain of evidence I'd just provided. His face had gone completely pale. All the bluster and authority drained away. Brad looked like he might be sick. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The other people in the room, a HR representative who'd been called in, the department head, 2 project team members, all sat frozen, reading through the emails on their own devices. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Every email was properly dated, properly documented, clearly written. They showed exactly who had done what work, who had solved which problems, who had communicated with the client, who had made the project successful. And that person was me? Only me. Brad appeared in the email chains occasionally, usually asking basic questions or missing meetings with brief apology notes. Kenneth appeared primarily in emails denying my requests for additional support or resources. The HR representative, a woman named Vanessa, spoke first. This is quite extensive documentation, she said carefully, her tone professional, but her expression deeply concerned. I think we need to review this thoroughly. Kenneth found his voice, though it came out strained. Dana, I don't think ambushing us with emails is... I'm not ambushing anyone, I said calmly. I'm providing requested documentation about project development and contributions. That seems relevant to the current situation. The investigation began that same afternoon. Vanessa from HR called me to her office for a private conversation. Unlike Kenneth's hostility, she was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the project timeline, my contributions, and the circumstances of my removal. I answered everything honestly, sticking to facts, avoiding emotional language or accusations. Just facts, dates, documentation. Can you walk me through your typical work process on this project? Vanessa asked, taking careful notes. I explained the late nights, the technical challenges solved, the client communications, the innovation required to make the impossible possible. I pulled up additional documentation showing the before and after states of various project components, clearly demonstrating the transformation from chaos to functional system. And Brad's contributions? Vanessa asked carefully. Brad attended some meetings, I said neutrally. His contributions are documented in the email chains I provided. He asked questions occasionally and offered suggestions, some of which were helpful. That was generous, but I didn't need to be vindictive. The evidence spoke clearly enough. Vanessa interviewed other team members, reviewed file access logs from the IT department, and examined the actual project deliverables in detail. The file access logs were particularly revealing. They showed that 95% of the technical work files had been created, modified, and maintained exclusively by me. Brad's file access was minimal, mostly limited to viewing shared documents. The bombshell discovery came 2 days later, on what would have been day 5 before the deadline. Vanessa called another meeting, this time including the department head and a senior company attorney. Kenneth and Brad were also present, both looking increasingly nervous. During our investigation, Vanessa began formally, we discovered something concerning. Brad submitted several progress reports to Kenneth over the past 2 months, claiming significant contributions to the project development. She pulled up documents on the conference room screen. They were reports Brad had written describing his supposed work on various technical components. Detailed descriptions of solving integration challenges, developing data mapping protocols, creating validation systems. These reports describe work that was actually completed by Dana, Vanessa continued, weeks or sometimes months before Brad's reports were submitted. He took early draft versions from the shared drive, added minor modifications, and presented them as finished work that he had personally completed. Brad's face went absolutely white. I was just trying to contribute. Vanessa held up her hand. We have timestamps on all files. We have email records showing when Dana completed this work and shared preliminary drafts for team review. We have your reports claiming this work as your own original contribution, submitted after Dana had already completed and moved past these phases. This isn't contribution. This is misrepresentation. Without the real framework, without the actual working systems I'd developed, the project collapsed catastrophically. Brad had tried desperately to recreate what he thought existed, based on the drafts he could access. He'd attempted to build systems that would satisfy the client's requirements, using only his surface-level understanding of what the project entailed. It didn't work. It couldn't work. Complex system integration requires deep understanding of data structures, transformation logic, error handling, security protocols, and dozens of other technical considerations. You can't fake that knowledge. You can't guess your way through it. Patricia from Apex Manufacturing called an emergency meeting on day 6 before the deadline. Kenneth and Brad attended. I was not included, which meant I heard about it secondhand again. But the story was consistent from multiple sources. Patricia was furious. She'd run preliminary tests on what Brad had provided, trying to be optimistic, trying to believe the project could still succeed. The systems had failed immediately and catastrophically. Data corruption errors. Integration failures. Security vulnerabilities. Nothing worked properly because Brad had fundamentally misunderstood how the various components connected and functioned together. This is completely unacceptable, Patricia had said, her voice cold with controlled rage. We gave you 6 months and $1.2 million. We were assured this project was on track. Now you're telling me it's basically non-functional with less than a week until go-live? The consequences came swiftly and decisively. Brad was fired that same afternoon. Vanessa and the company attorney called him into a meeting and terminated his employment, effective immediately, citing misrepresentation of work contributions and violation of professional ethics standards. He was escorted from the building by security, his personal items packed into a single cardboard box. I watched from my desk as he walked past, his face flushed with humiliation, unable to meet anyone's eyes. 4 months of pretending to contribute, of taking credit for my work, of playing golf with Kenneth while I worked late nights, all of it had imploded in less than a week. The project he'd been so eager to claim credit for had destroyed his career instead. Kenneth wasn't fired, but his consequences were severe nonetheless. The department head called him in for what was described as a very difficult conversation. By the end of the day, Kenneth had been formally demoted from senior manager to project coordinator, losing his team leadership responsibilities and taking a significant pay cut. The official explanation cited serious lapses in judgment regarding personnel management and project oversight. The favoritism, the failure to recognize actual contributions, the last-minute personnel change that jeopardized a million-dollar client relationship, all of it was documented in his permanent record. He'd probably never recover his previous position, and everyone in the department knew exactly why he'd been demoted. More fallout continued over the following days. The project team members who'd witnessed my humiliation in that conference room now looked at me differently. Some approached my desk to apologize for not speaking up when I was removed. Others just nodded respectfully when we passed in hallways. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically. Patricia from Apex Manufacturing was a separate problem entirely. She was furious with Blackwell Technologies for the disaster, threatening to cancel not just the Cornerstone project but all future business relationships. The company stood to lose millions in potential contracts. The senior leadership team held multiple emergency meetings trying to salvage the situation. On day 3 after Brad's firing, I received a meeting request from the company's vice president of operations, a senior executive I'd never interacted with directly before. His name was Vincent, and he had a reputation for being brilliant but absolutely ruthless when it came to business performance. I accepted the meeting, already anticipating what was coming. Vincent's office was on the executive floor, decorated with expensive furniture and awards from industry associations. He stood when I entered, shaking my hand firmly. "Dana, thank you for meeting with me," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I've been reviewing the Cornerstone situation in detail, and I need your help." The offer Vincent made was straightforward and desperate. The company was begging me to return to lead a recovery project, to salvage what remained of the client relationship, and attempt to deliver something functional. "We recognize that serious mistakes were made in your treatment," Vincent said carefully. "Kenneth showed extremely poor judgment, and Brad violated professional ethics. We've taken corrective action, but that doesn't fix the client relationship or the project itself." He slid a formal offer letter across his desk. "We're prepared to restore you as project lead, provide whatever resources you need, extend the deadline in negotiation with the client, and ensure you receive full credit for your work." The offer included a substantial raise, a promotion to senior systems architect, a bonus tied to successful project completion, and a formal written apology from the company. It was a good offer, genuinely good. 2 weeks ago, I would have been thrilled to receive it. Vincent watched me carefully as I read through the offer. "We've already spoken with Patricia at Apex," he continued. "She specifically requested that you be returned to the project. She said you're the only person at this company who actually understands their needs." I set the offer letter down and looked directly at Vincent. "I appreciate the recognition," I said calmly, "but I need 24 hours to consider this carefully." I declined the offer the next day. Respectfully, professionally, but firmly. Vincent was genuinely surprised when I called him to explain my decision. "The offer is generous," I told him honestly, "and I appreciate the acknowledgement of what happened, but I've accepted a position with another company that better aligns with my career goals." That wasn't entirely true when I first declined, but it became true very quickly. Because Patricia from Apex Manufacturing had called me directly, on my personal cell phone, the same evening I'd met with Vincent. "Dana," she'd said when I answered, "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to reach out personally. Apex is withdrawing from the contract with Blackwell. We can't trust them after this disaster." "I understand," I'd said, genuinely sympathetic to her frustration. "But I want to hire you directly." Patricia continued. "Come work for Apex. We need someone with your skills to lead our entire technology integration department. We're not just talking about salvaging the Cornerstone project, we're talking about building a whole new team around your expertise." The offer she described was substantially better than Vincent's. Higher salary, full department leadership, equity options, relocation assistance if needed, and complete autonomy over technology decisions. "You'd be reporting directly to me," Patricia said. No middle managers taking credit for your work, no office politics, just results and respect. My rise at Apex Manufacturing was remarkably swift. I started as Director of Technology Integration, with a salary nearly 50% higher than what I'd been making at Blackwell. I had a team of 8 talented developers who actually respected expertise over politics. I had a corner office with windows overlooking the city. I had decision-making authority that Kenneth had never possessed, despite his senior manager title. Most importantly, I had respect from day one. Patricia introduced me at a company-wide meeting as the brilliant systems architect who's going to revolutionize how we handle our technology infrastructure. People listened when I spoke in meetings. My ideas were implemented without endless committee reviews. When I identified problems, I was trusted to solve them without micromanagement or second-guessing. The Cornerstone project was my first major initiative. Patricia gave me complete authority to rebuild it properly, with adequate resources, realistic timelines, and full support. I hired 2 of the talented developers from Blackwell who'd been stuck under Kenneth's poor management. They were thrilled to escape that toxic environment and work somewhere their contributions would be recognized. We completed the rebuilt project in 4 months. It worked perfectly, exceeding all the original specifications. Patricia presented me with a substantial bonus and announced my promotion to Vice President of Technology Integration, a newly created executive position. I walked out of Blackwell Technologies for the last time on a Friday afternoon, carrying a small box of personal items from my desk. The office was relatively quiet, many people already gone for the weekend. Kenneth was at his new desk in the corner, no longer in an office, no longer managing anyone. He didn't look up as I passed. I didn't say goodbye to him. Brad was long gone, his career in shambles, his reputation destroyed. The project team members I'd worked with stopped by my desk earlier in the day, wishing me well, some apologizing again for not defending me when it mattered. I forgave them easily. Most people don't risk their own careers to defend someone else, especially in toxic environments. I understood that. As I walked through the lobby toward the exit, carrying my box, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of that place, the constant stress of proving myself to people who would never truly value me, all of it was lifting away with each step. I thought about the journey from that humiliating conference room meeting to this moment. How devastating that betrayal had felt at the time. How it had actually become the catalyst for something far better. They thought they were taking away my career. Instead, they freed me to find where I actually belonged. I walked out into the late afternoon sunshine, head held high, while somewhere behind me in that building, the people who'd underestimated me watched the one they'd dismissed thrive beyond anything they'd imagined possible.